Catherine Murphy, uninterrupted, please. Thank you.
As you prepare to leave the office of Taoiseach, it's an appropriate time to reflect on your tenure in office. You've repeatedly said you consider housing the most important social issue in the country, but your record tells a different story. It's not a record of problem solving, it's a record of problems multiplying. We now have a crisis that has morphed from a crisis into a disaster. The facts speak for themselves. House prices have never been higher, rents have never been higher, and homelessness has never been higher. We learned on Friday that there are now a record 11,397 people, including 3,480 children, living in emergency accommodation. Taoiseach, the housing emergency is not always just about bricks and mortar. The price of the disaster is being paid by the thousands of children, many not meeting milestones, losing childhoods as they grow up in emergency accommodation, and homelessness has almost become normalised. The price is being paid also by the relationships that break down because of the stress of housing insecurity, and by the couples who postpone having a family, and by the disconnected communities that result when people are unable to put down roots. So Taoiseach, when is this going to end? Or at the very least, when are we going to see some tangible improvements? Because the thousands of people who took to the streets for the Raise the Roof rally on Saturday don't see any evidence that your government is treating this crisis like it is an emergency. I met teachers at the protest who can no longer afford to live in Dublin or indeed other cities and have no option but to leave the profession or leave the country. It's the same story for other workers in other sectors, and we have a huge skills shortage, partly because of this. Who can afford to spend the astronomical $28,000 per annum in rent to live in Dublin, or indeed more than $20,000 in other parts of the country? Pretty soon, Taoiseach, the only people who will be able to afford rent in this country will be bankers, who will see their gold-plated €20,000 bonuses restored with the decision that was made by the government today. So you're delivering for the bankers, but what about the workers in sectors that didn't have any hand, act or part in collapsing the housing sector? Or all they hear from you are broken promises. You say housing is your top priority, yet 11 local authorities failed to deliver a single new home build in the first half of 2022. Not a single home constructed in 6 months in vast swathes of the country, in the biggest housing crisis in a generation. This includes 3 local authorities in Dublin where the crisis is at its most acute. Meanwhile, nearly 500 million of your housing budget for the first 9 months of this year wasn't even spent. It should be no surprise then that the government will miss its modest targets of building 4,100 affordable and cost rental homes this year. So Taoiseach, talk is cheap, and your commitments on housing now lie in tatters. My question is, do you accept your tenure as Taoiseach has been a failure when it comes to housing?
No, I do not, and I would say that some very fundamental decisions have been taken that have changed the momentum in relation to housing for the next decade, and already we are on track, for example, for exceeding this year's target in housing for all of 24,600. We're on track to exceed that this year. And when you consider that we had 2 significant lockdowns during COVID, and COVID has dominated the first 1.5 to 2 years of this government, and when you take it then coming out of COVID, the inflationary cycle plus the war in Ukraine and the exponential increase in the cost of building materials, we've continued on with new schemes, new approaches, and with record legislation in the housing field. I mean, there have been 17 bills enacted since this government came into office. Major bills like the Land Development Agency Act, which is going to be there now for the long term. And we saw its work already in Shangana. Now, some of the opposition voted against that, but the 600 units last week now that are underway because of the Land Development Agency and the Act being established. The Affordable Housing Act, which establishes the Affordable Housing Purchase Scheme, the 6th Residential Tenancies Act to enhance tenants' protections, introducing a 2% rent cap, extended RPZ zones to the end of 2024, restricted deposits, in terms of what landlords can do with deposits, extended notice to quit periods, the winter eviction ban, and a whole range of legislative elements. The Help to Buy scheme is now, maximum payment of 30,000, has helped thousands and thousands of ordinary people to buy their first home. And in fact, this year alone, we're on record in terms of 16,000 first-time buyers in the past 12 months. That's the highest number since 2007, represents 33% of all home purchases, up from 25% in 2015. In terms of social housing, again, we're looking at this year a record year in terms of the number of social houses that will be provided through build, through lease, and through acquisition itself. And about 18,500 social houses have been provided since this government came into office, which is again very significant ramping up of activity on the social housing front. And if you add the 5,000 in voids that we've brought back in. So we are producing additional housing. The issue is for us, we need to produce more, and we need to produce housing more rapidly. And that means more rapid build. And the Department of Housing is focusing on that aspect of it now, particularly on public lands, that we can get more rapid build social housing into play. And we're also increasing the supports for home ownership. On top of the Help to Buy, we have the First Home Scheme, about 700 now. Approvals already in respect of that, and also in terms of Project Tusig from the Land Development Agency, again targeting about 5,000 in terms of existing planning commissions on the private side that it's hoping to bring into operation to create affordable housing for people out there. So there's a lot of activity there.
Thank you,
and it's about supply, and it's about trying to get delivery faster.
Taoiseach, you said nothing about the 11,397. You said nothing about the 11,397 people who are homeless in emergency accommodation, including almost 3,500 children who will spend this Christmas in homelessness accommodation. It's almost become permanent. It's become normalised. We get these figures at the last, on one of the Fridays towards the end of each month, and each time they're going up. We've seen a reduction in commencements in the last 3 months. What about those local authority, no local authority bills, new bills in the first 6 months of this year in 11 local authorities? It doesn't suggest an emergency. The facts are we've the highest rents. Housing costs have never been, or the cost of buying a house has never been higher. We've got lots of targets, but people can't live in targets. They can't rent targets. They need to see this crisis delivering as though it's an emergency, where you're actually seeing the results on the ground, and people are losing hope, Taoiseach. And certainly, you can see that. You could see that on Saturday, talking to people at that demonstration.
Yeah, again, I mean, deputies opposite keep talking the word emergency, but why did you oppose the Land Development Agency bill? Why did you oppose the Affordable Housing Act? Is it really an emergency when you indulge in the luxury of opposing legislation that provides additional supply on public land? I mean, that's the problem. I feel that people articulate a lot of rhetoric here about emergency, urgency, and so on like that. But I would suggest to the chair that rhetoric sometimes isn't matched. I think the homeless issue is a very serious issue, and we need more supply, Deputy, to deal with that. And that is why we've ramped up social housing supply very significantly to deal with the issue of homelessness and the waiting lists as well for people trying to get social housing. I mean, that's why we've ramped it up, and it's up very significantly. And if you look at the number of workers now working in construction, there's 40,000 more people working in construction this year than last year, 20,000 more than in 2019. So that also shows we're doing everything we possibly can to ramp up capacity within the construction sector so that we can build more houses.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
It's ultimately about supply. And then we have the winter eviction ban to try and reduce homelessness during the winter period.
Ik bogger Rai Guji and Group in Yasplak. Ich have to Joan Collins.
Thanks, Cian Cole. Thanks,